the end of 2014, which means it's time to look at my favourite books of the year. I've divided this into 3 different parts. I'm going to look at my favourites from 2014, all other fiction from before that, because if I combine the two, it'll be mostly classics, and that might be a little boring for some people. I've also added a top 5 non-fiction. It's been a focus of mine this year to read more non-fiction, and I want to share my favourite books from that category or that genre. Number 5 in my top 5 for 2014 is Grasshopper Jungle, which is about a boy growing up in Ohio who falls in love with this girl, but at the same time he starts having feelings for his best friend, and he's confused by these feelings and he has to work out what's going on and tries to understand his sexuality. There's a great line in this book where he asks his friend if he thinks he's gay, and his friend basically tells him it doesn't matter, that one word can't define you. It's a really good book and I highly recommend this one. It's Grasshopper Jungle by Anthony Smith. Oh, and while this is all happening, the world is being taken over by giant grasshoppers, so there's that as well. Number 4 is actually Station 11. Most people have probably heard it, it's probably made up most lists. It's a post-apocalyptic novel. It's got a literary feel to it and it explores concepts of art, and I won't go into the plot because most people probably have heard about this book by now. Number 3 would be the first trade for Miss Marvel. I'm really loving this comic at the moment. It's the first time in Marvel history where a superhero has been a teenage Muslim American girl, and this has been a fantastic series. It explores her coming to acceptance of her powers, but it also goes through her struggles with her family life and her religion, and being a Pakistani American living in New Jersey. Number 2 is Belzar, which basically is about a girl that is struggling with grief, and she gets sent to this boarding school. At the boarding school, she's been put into a special English class where they have to study Sylvia Plath, so it's part contemporary fiction and it's also sort of like a literary critique of the bell jar by Sylvia Plath. I love this book because it focuses a lot on Sylvia Plath's bell jar and it gives you a basic understanding of the book and the person, and it's a good way to do this kind of literary criticism. Finally, the number 1 spot for 2014 is All That Is Solid Melts Into Air. This is a book about a group of different people growing up in Ukraine and just trying to struggle and live under Soviet rule. This is happening during the collapse of the Soviet Union, but at the same time the Chernobyl nuclear disaster happens, so there's a whole element about the nuclear disaster and a cover-up by the government and what could have been done to prevent the crisis. This is a fantastic book, and if you read A Constellation for a Vital Phenomena, I think this would be a great pairing with that book. Now moving on to the backlist, and this year my top 5 have all been classics or modern classic. At number 5 is In the First Circle. The reason why I wait so long to do this list is because there's always a book that sneaks in and really changes your opinion about the year, and for me this year it's In the First Circle. It's set in Christmas time in 1948. This starts off with a guy calling on a payphone from inside Moscow to tell the American embassy about the Russian project to create the atom bomb, and it then follows the story of a brilliant mathematician which has been made prisoner and forced to help the Russians try and find out who made this call. There is a whole cast of characters within this book, but it really focuses on that prison where they're trying to find out who made the call to the Americans, and it talks a lot about the penal code and Soviet history. I highly recommend this book. Number 4 is The Odyssey by Homer. I had to read this book for uni and I was blown away. I have no idea why I put it off for so long. For some reason I had always been a little afraid of the Greek classics, but when I finally had to do this book for uni, I was fascinated by the book. It's got these interesting ideas on how they portray women, and unfortunately those ideas still seem relevant today. But it's a great book and I highly recommend this one if you haven't tried it. I'm reading the Oxford Classics. I love these editions, and this was an amazing translation and so easy to read. Number 3 was probably the biggest book I read this year, and that was War and Peace by Tolstoy. I've been trying to make my way through Russian literature for a while now, and the big books sometimes put me off, but this year I made it a bit of a project to complete Tolstoy, and I'm so glad that I did. It was a fantastic book that follows a whole cast of different characters during the war with Napoleon. It did take me a while to finish, but it was well worth it, and I'm finally able to say that I've read War and Peace now. At number 2 is The Sorrow of Young Werther, and this is a very short book, but I really enjoyed this one. It's about this young artist and he's feeling alienated by society. It's still very relevant today, very emotional and angsty, and I love that kind of thing. At number 1 was a book that took me about 6 months to read, and that was Middlemarch. I took my time with this one because I knew there was going to be a lot in it, and it was well worth it. It's the type of book you can dip in and out of, and thankfully I did, because I was able to just reflect on what I read and enjoy the writing style. I read this with a reading guide, which actually helped me through it and probably enhanced my enjoyment of this book. It's 880 pages, but well worth the time. It's a social critique on this little small town called Middlemarch, and definitely my favourite for this year on the backlist. Now moving on to the non-fiction. Because I struggled for a long time with non-fiction, I kind of got around that by reading books about books, and that allowed me to get used to non-fiction writing, and I ended up starting to really enjoy it. So here's a list for the best non-fiction of 2014, or in my opinion anyway. These are not all released in 2014, but here you go. Number 5 is What We See When We Read. This is a beautiful book that just explores the philosophy and the ideas behind reading. And just talks about different things like what our mind pictures, do we know what Anna Karenina looks like, and stuff like that. And it was really great. It's a nice little edition with pictures and everything in it, and I highly recommend getting this if you're a book lover. The next is a book called Levels of Love by Julian. It's a part memoir, part creative non-fiction. It is told in 3 parts and explores a balloonist and the life of an explorer. And the 3rd part is talking about the loss of his wife and his grief behind that. So it kind of explores love in 3 different stages, and it's a beautiful little book. I actually cried in it, which is something I don't often do in books. At number 3, I finally got around to that true crime classic In Cold Blood by Truman Capote. I don't know why I put this off. I read Breakfast at Tiffany by Capote this year as well, and I absolutely loved that book. And I thought, well, since I love that book, I might as well read In Cold Blood, and it was definitely worth the effort. Most of you know what the book's about. It follows Capote's research into this crime. Some might say it's fiction, but it does normally get categorised as true crime, so I'm putting it on my non-fiction list. At number 2 is Ex Libris, which is a collection of essays by a reader, and she's really wry and intelligent, and I loved every moment of this. It just explores different parts of her life and how reading has affected her life. I don't actually have a copy to show you, but it is a book that I'll definitely have to add to my collection. And finally, the number 1 book is The Darkest Path, which is a memoir about growing up in the Catholic Church and wanting to become a Catholic priest, but then David discovered an attraction to women, and this really captures his struggle between becoming a priest or dating women. This is a really great book. I read this earlier this year, and I highly recommend it for people that want to look at an internal struggle or are fascinated in religious memoirs. There you have it. That's my top 5 in the 3 categories. I'll put a link to the blog entry that mentions these 15 books, and that'll link you to the reviews of the books I've done on my blog. Please let me know in the comments what your favourite books were for the year, and I hope you enjoyed 2015. Thanks for watching.